A cold-hearted millionaire forces his son's fiancée to prove her love in a cruel test, but what he discovers will leave him devastated for the rest of his life. But before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe and comment. Below, from where are you watching from today? The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Victor Langston's penthouse office. At 62 years old, he stood there in his custom-made suit, looking down at the city he'd conquered. Everything he touched turned to gold. Well, almost everything. Victor's eyes drifted to the silver frame on his desk, showing a picture of his son Ethan's graduation day. His boy was smiling, but Victor could see the sadness in his eyes, the same look his late wife Margaret used to have. "Mr. Langston," his assistant Sarah's voice came through the intercom. "Your son is here to see you." Victor pressed the button. "Send him in." Ethan walked in, looking exactly like the successful banker he was supposed to be, but Victor could tell something was different. His son was practically bouncing with excitement. "Dad, I need to tell you something important." Ethan couldn't hold back his smile. "I'm getting married." Victor felt his stomach drop, but he kept his face neutral. "Married? To whom?" "Vanessa Sterling. We've been dating for 6 months. I know it seems fast, but when you know, you know." Ethan's eyes were shining with joy. "She's amazing, Dad. Beautiful, smart, comes from a good family. You'll love her." Victor had heard of the Sterlings. New money, if you could even call. Besides that, their shipping company had gone bankrupt 2 years ago, but what worried him more was how little he knew about this woman who'd managed to capture his son's heart so quickly. 6 months isn't very long, son," Victor said carefully. "Are you sure about this?" Ethan's face fell slightly. "I knew you'd say that. You always think someone's trying to take advantage of us, but Vanessa isn't like that. She loves me for who I am, not what I have. I just want you to be careful," Victor tried to explain. "Remember what happened with Jessica? That was different. I was young and stupid then. I'm 32 now, Dad. I know what I'm doing." Ethan straightened his shoulders. "We're having an engagement party next weekend at the mansion. I want you to meet her properly." Victor nodded slowly. "Of course, I'll be there." After Ethan left, Victor sat heavily in his leather chair. Something wasn't right. He could feel it in his bones, the same instinct that had helped him build his empire from nothing. He pressed the intercom button again. "Sarah, get me everything you can find on Vanessa Sterling. And I mean everything." The next few days, Victor buried himself in reports about Vanessa. On paper, she looked perfect. Graduated from an Ivy League school, worked in public relations, came from a respectable family. But there were gaps, things that didn't add up, like how she'd managed to maintain her luxurious lifestyle after her family's company collapsed, or why she'd suddenly quit her job at a top PR firm 3 months before meeting Ethan. The engagement party was held in the grand ballroom of the Langston mansion. Victor watched from a corner as Vanessa worked the room like a professional, her red designer dress catching everyone's eye. She was beautiful. There was no denying that. Long dark hair, green eyes, and a smile that could charm anyone. But Victor noticed how that smile never quite reached her eyes. "She's quite something, isn't she?" Maria, the family's housekeeper, for the past 30 years appeared beside him. She'd helped raise Ethan after Margaret's death, and Victor trusted her judgment more than anyone's. "What do you think of her, Maria?" Maria hesitated. "She's very polite, always says please and thank you. But sometimes when Mr. Ethan isn't looking, she has this look in her eyes, like she's calculating something." Victor nodded. That's exactly what he'd been thinking. He watched as Vanessa laughed at something one of the guests said, her hand resting possessively on Ethan's arm. His son looked at her like she hung the moon. "I need your help with something, Maria," Victor said quietly. "But you have to promise to keep it absolutely secret." Maria looked at him suspiciously. "What are you planning, Mr. Langston?" "I need to protect my son, but I can't do it as Victor Langston." He turned to face her fully. "I need to become someone else, someone invisible, someone who can watch Vanessa when she thinks no one's looking." Maria's eyes widened as she understood. "You want to spy on her, Mr. Langston? That's crazy." "Not spy, observe, and I need you to help me do it." Victor looked back at the party, where Vanessa was now showing off her enormous engagement ring to a group of admiring women. "I need you to introduce your nephew Ben, the new janitor, to the household staff." "But I don't have a nephew named Ben," Maria protested. "Exactly." Victor's face was grim. "Starting tomorrow, you do, and he's going to help us find out who Vanessa Sterling really is." That night, after the party was over and the guests had gone home, Victor stood in his study looking at Margaret's portrait above the fireplace. "Am I doing the right thing?" he whispered to her silent image. "Or am I just being a controlling old man who can't let go?" The portrait didn't answer, but Victor knew what he had to do. He opened his safe and took out a small box he hadn't touched in years. Inside was a pair of thick-rimmed glasses, ones he'd worn before he could afford laser surgery. They would be the first piece of his disguise. As he planned out the details of becoming Ben the janitor, Victor couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to uncover something bigger than just a gold digger after his son's money. There was something in Vanessa's eyes when she thought no one was watching, something that reminded him of a predator sizing up its prey. If he was right, his son was in danger of losing more than just his heart. But if he was wrong, he might lose his son's trust forever. So either way, Victor Langston was about to embark on the most important undercover operation of his life, one where the stakes were far higher than mere millions. "Hold still, Mr. Langston," Maria said as she applied the grey colour to his hair. They were in the basement of the mansion, far from prying eyes. It was 5 in the morning and Victor was getting his first lesson in becoming Ben the janitor. "How much longer?" Victor asked, trying not to fidget. The chemical smell was giving him a headache. "Beauty takes time," Maria replied, a hint of amusement in her voice. "Even when you're trying to look worse." Victor looked in the mirror. The man staring back at him was already starting to look different. The thick glasses changed his face, and the grey hair dye would age him another 10 years. He'd practiced walking with a slight stoop, wearing clothes he'd bought from a discount store. "Now remember," Maria said as she rinsed his hair, "Ben is my nephew from Ohio. His marriage ended badly and he needed a fresh start. That's why he came to work here." "I know the story, Maria." Victor had spent weeks planning every detail. The board of directors thought he was taking a month-long meditation retreat in Tibet, something so out of character that no one would question why they couldn't reach him directly. "And you remember that the staff starts arriving at 7? The gardeners come first, then the kitchen staff at 8. Maria handed him a rough towel. "I remember everything." Victor stood up, his knees cracking. He wasn't used to sitting on low plastic chairs anymore. "What I need to know is Vanessa's schedule." Maria's face turned serious. "She usually arrives around 10 unless Mr. Ethan stays here. Then she's here for breakfast. She's been pushing to move in before the wedding, but Mr. Ethan wants to wait." "Good boy," Victor muttered. At least his son had some sense left. "She spends most of her time in the East Wing," Maria continued. "She says she's planning the wedding, but mostly she's on her phone or laptop and—" Maria hesitated. "What is it?" "She's been going through the family photos, old albums, pictures of your late wife. Says she wants to understand the family history, but something about it doesn't feel right." Victor felt a chill run down his spine. What was Vanessa looking for in those old photos? At exactly 7 o'clock, Ben the janitor reported for his first day of work. The head of maintenance, Mr. Rodriguez, gave him a quick tour and a list of duties. Victor was surprised by how no one looked twice at him. Amazing what a uniform and the right attitude could do. He was mopping the hallway outside the library when he heard voices. Vanessa was there with someone, a man's voice he didn't recognize. "Everything's going according to plan," Vanessa was saying. "The old man doesn't suspect a thing." Victor moved closer to the door, his heart pounding. "But he's not stupid, V," the man replied. "Victor Langston didn't build an empire by being naive. Please. He's so desperate to see his precious son happy that he's blind to everything else. Besides, he's away on some spiritual retreat. By the time he gets back, it'll be too late." Victor's hands tightened on the mop handle. Who was this man? "Just make sure you find it," the man said. "We didn't come this far to fail now. Don't worry about that." Vanessa's voice was cold. "I know it's here somewhere. Margaret Langston kept records of everything." Victor nearly dropped the mop. They were looking for something of Margaret's? But what? The door started to open and Victor quickly resumed mopping, keeping his head down. Vanessa walked past him without a glance, but the man, tall, well-dressed with silver hair, gave him a sharp look. "Who are you?" he demanded. "Ben Miller, sir," Victor said, in a thick Midwest accent he'd practiced for weeks. "New janitor. Started today." The man stared at him for a moment longer, then followed Vanessa down the hall. Victor waited until they were gone before pulling out his phone, a cheap flip phone, nothing like his usual smartphone, and texted Maria, "Need to know who that man was. Silver hair, expensive suit, around 60. A few minutes later, she replied, "James Sterling, Vanessa's uncle, the one who ran the shipping company into the ground." Victor's mind was racing. What were they looking for? What had Margaret kept? Records of? And why were they so desperate to find it? He was still pondering these questions when Ethan arrived home early from work. His son looked troubled, distracted. Victor watched from behind a plant he was supposedly dusting as Ethan paced the hallway, making a phone call. I know, Ethan was saying, but I can't just. No, you don't understand. If my father ever found out, yes, I still have them, they're safe. Look, I'll call you back. Victor felt like his head was spinning. First, Vanessa and her uncle were searching for something of Margaret's, and now Ethan was hiding something too. What had his wife known? What secrets had she taken to her grave? That evening, after his shift ended, Victor sat in the small apartment he'd rented as part of his cover. His back ached from neprivichny physical work, but his mind was sharp. He opened a notebook and started writing. 1. Vanessa and James Sterling are looking for something Margaret kept records of. 2. Ethan is hiding something about Margaret. 3. There's a deadline, too late when I get back from retreat. One thing was clear. This wasn't just about a gold digger trying to marry into money. There was something bigger going on, something that went back to Margaret's time, and somehow his dead wife was at the center of it all. Victor took off his glasses and rubbed his tired eyes. He'd thought he was protecting his son from a fortune hunter, but he'd stumbled onto something much darker. The question was, how much danger were they all in? He looked at his phone. 3 missed calls from the office, all marked urgent. But Victor Langston couldn't answer them. Right now, he needed to be Ben Miller, the invisible janitor who might be the only person who could uncover the truth before it was too late. The next morning, Victor's muscles screamed in protest as he climbed the mansion's service stairs. He'd never realized how much actual work janitors did. His hands were already developing calluses from the mop handle. "Morning, Ben," called out Rosa from the kitchen. She was the cook's assistant and had taken a motherly interest in Ben since his arrival. "Coffee's fresh if you want some." "Thanks," Victor replied in Ben's humble voice. He'd learned that the service areas were where the real information flowed. The staff saw everything. As he poured his coffee into a cheap plastic cup, so different from his usual fine china, he overheard 2 maids talking. "Did you see Miss Sterling going through the old storage rooms again?" one whispered. "3rd time this week. Mrs. Garcia caught her in there at midnight last night." Victor's ears perked up. Mrs. Garcia was the night housekeeper. "She said she was looking for wedding inspiration," the other maid replied. "But who looks for inspiration in dusty old boxes at midnight?" Victor made a mental note to check those storage rooms himself, but first he had other concerns. Ethan was bringing Vanessa's parents over for lunch today, the first time Victor wouldn't be present for such an important family event. He positioned himself to clean the windows of the dining room just before they arrived. Through the reflection in the glass, he watched as Ethan welcomed Robert and Diana Sterling. Robert looked nervous, constantly tugging at his collar, while Diana's smile seemed frozen in place. "Such a lovely home," Diana gushed, her eyes darting around the room like she was appraising everything. "It's been in your family for generations, hasn't it, Ethan dear?" "4 generations," Ethan replied proudly. "My great-grandfather built it." "And where is your father?" Robert asked, his voice slightly strained. "We were hoping to discuss some business opportunities with him." Victor noticed how Vanessa shot her father a warning look. "Dad's at a meditation retreat," Ethan explained. "He's been working too hard lately. The doctors insisted he take a break." "How convenient," Diana murmured, then quickly added, "I mean, how wise of him to take care of his health." Victor finished the windows and moved to dust the antique cabinet nearby, keeping his head down but his ears open. "Speaking of business," Robert said, "Ethan, my boy, I was wondering if you'd given any thought to that investment opportunity I mentioned." Vanessa interrupted smoothly. "Daddy, we agreed. No business talk today. This is about family." But Victor had seen the hungry look in Robert's eyes. The man was desperate for something. Later that afternoon, Victor managed to slip away to the storage rooms. They were in the old servants' wing, a maze of small rooms filled with decades of family history. He found the boxes Vanessa had been going through, photo albums, old documents, Margaret's personal papers. One album caught his eye. It was from about a year before Margaret's death, showing a charity gala. In one photo, Margaret stood with James Sterling, Vanessa's uncle. They were arguing about something. Victor remembered that night Margaret had been upset, but she'd never told him why. He flipped through more photos and suddenly stopped. There was a picture of Margaret in her study, sitting at her desk. On the desk was a distinctive wooden box with brass fittings. Victor remembered that box. Margaret had always kept it locked. After her death, he'd looked for it but never found it. What are you doing in here? Victor nearly dropped the album. Vanessa stood in the doorway, her eyes suspicious. Just cleaning, Mom, he said quickly, gesturing to the feather duster he'd brought as cover. Mr. Rodriguez said these rooms needed attention. Vanessa stepped closer, looking at the album in his hands. You should be more careful with these things. They're family heirlooms. Yes, Ma'am. Sorry, Ma'am. Victor carefully put the album back. Wait. Vanessa picked up the album, staring at the photo of Margaret and her uncle. When was this taken? Don't rightly know, Ma'am, before my time here. Vanessa's phone buzzed. She checked it and her face hardened. Make sure you dust properly, she said coldly, before hurrying out. Victor waited a few minutes, then followed. He found a spot to mop near Vanessa's usual phone spot in the garden. She was arguing with someone. I don't care what it takes, she was saying. That box has to be here somewhere. Margaret wouldn't have destroyed it. No, Ethan doesn't suspect anything. He's too trusting, just like his mother. We have 3 weeks until the wedding. Find it. Victor's heart was pounding. What was in that box? And why were they so desperate to find it? He was still pondering this when he literally ran into Ethan coming around a corner. The cleaning supplies went flying. I'm so sorry. Ethan immediately bent to help pick things up. Are you okay? Ben, sir. Ben Miller. Right. Maria's nephew. Ethan smiled kindly. She mentioned you'd started working. Here? As they gathered the supplies, a piece of paper fell from Ethan's pocket. Victor caught a glimpse of what looked like old handwriting before Ethan snatched it up, his face suddenly pale. Is everything all right, sir? Victor asked carefully. Yes, fine. Ethan stuffed the paper back in his pocket. Just some old family matters. Victor watched his son hurry away, his shoulders tense. The paper had looked old, yellowed, like something from Margaret's time. That evening, Victor met with Maria in the security of his small apartment. I need you to tell me everything you remember about Margaret's last year, he said, especially anything about a wooden box with brass fittings. Maria's face went white. The box? That's what they're looking for? You know about it? Mrs. Margaret made me promise never to tell anyone, Maria whispered. She said lives could be ruined if the wrong people found it. What was in it? I don't know, but the night before she died, she said something strange. She said, the truth will set them free, but the lie keeps them safe. Maria crossed herself. The next morning we found her. Victor remembered that horrible morning. Margaret had apparently fallen down the stairs in the night. The police ruled it an accident, but now, 20 years later, Victor was starting to wonder, had it really been an accident? Victor couldn't sleep that night. He kept seeing Margaret's face in his mind, not from the photos, but from that last evening. She'd been trying to tell him something over dinner, but he'd been too busy with a merger to really listen. The next morning, she was gone. The guilt had eaten at him for 20 years. Now it felt like hot coals in his stomach. Dawn found him back at the mansion earlier than usual. He had to know more about that box. As he pushed his cleaning cart down the quiet hallway, he heard crying coming from the library. It was Ethan sitting alone in the dark, holding what looked like an old letter. Victor's heart ached to go to his son, but Ben, the janitor, couldn't do that. Instead, he deliberately made noise with his cart, giving Ethan time to compose himself. Oh, Ben. Ethan quickly wiped his eyes. You're here early. Sorry to disturb you, sir, just getting an early start. Ethan stood up, and Victor saw him tuck the letter into a book before putting it back on the shelf. He noted which book it was. Great Expectations, Margaret's favorite. Ben, Ethan said suddenly, you're Maria's nephew, right? Did she ever talk about my mother? Victor's heart skipped a beat. Some, sir. She said Mrs. Langston was a kind woman. She was. Ethan's voice cracked. Sometimes I think she was too kind, too trusting. He looked at Victor with red-rimmed eyes. Can I tell you something? Sometimes it's easier talking to a stranger. Of course, sir. I found something about my mother, about what really happened the night she died. Ethan ran his hands through his hair. But I don't know what to do about it. If I tell my father, it would destroy him. Before Victor could respond, they heard the click of heels on hardwood. Vanessa. Darling, are you in here? She appeared in the doorway, wearing a designer workout outfit. Her smile faltered when she saw Ethan's face. What's wrong? Nothing, just missing Mom. Vanessa's expression softened, but Victor noticed her eyes dart to the bookshelf where Ethan had hidden the letter. Oh, sweetheart, I know it's hard not having her here for the wedding. She wrapped her arms around him, but I'm sure she'd be happy for us. Over Ethan's shoulder, Vanessa's eyes met Victor's. There was something calculating in them. "Ben, isn't it? Would you mind giving us a moment?" "Of course, ma'am." Victor pushed his cart out but stayed close enough to hear. "Ethan, darling," Vanessa's voice turned serious. "I've been thinking, maybe we should postpone the wedding." "What? Why?" "Well, with your father away, and you obviously struggling with memories of your mother, maybe we should wait until everyone's in a better place." Victor could hear the manipulation in her voice. She was fishing for something. "No," Ethan said firmly. "No more waiting. We've already sent the invitations." "But, Vanessa, I love you. I want to marry you. Unless there's some reason you want to wait." There was a long pause. "Of course not, darling. I just worry about you." Later that morning, Victor watched as James Sterling's black Mercedes pulled up to the mansion. The silver-haired man looked agitated as Vanessa met him in the garden. Victor positioned himself to trim the nearby hedges, straining to hear their conversation. "Time is running out," James was saying. "The board meeting is in 2 weeks." "I know that," Vanessa snapped, "but I can't find the damn box anywhere. And now Ethan's acting strange. He found something about his mother." "Margaret?" James went pale. "What did he find?" "I don't know, but we need to speed things up. I've got a plan." She lowered her voice, but Victor caught the words prenup and emergency. That afternoon, Victor was cleaning the windows in Margaret's old study, now Ethan's home office, when he noticed something odd about the wooden paneling behind the desk. One panel seemed slightly different from the others. He was examining it when he heard voices approaching. Quickly, he grabbed his cleaning supplies and stepped into the attached bathroom. Vanessa entered with a man Victor didn't recognize, younger than James, wearing an expensive suit. "This was her study," Vanessa was saying. "If she hid anything, it would be in here." "The box isn't here," the man said. "We've searched everywhere." "Then search again. Without those documents, everything falls apart." Vanessa paced the room. 20 years ago, Margaret Langston discovered something that could have ruined everyone. Instead of using it, she died. We need to find out what she knew. And if we don't, Vanessa's voice turned cold. Then we move to plan B. Sometimes history repeats itself. Accidents happen. Victor's blood ran cold. Was Vanessa threatening what he thought she was? After they left, he rushed to text Maria. "Need to meet. Emergency." They met in the garden shed during Maria's break. When Victor told her what he'd overheard, she crossed herself again. "Dios mío," she whispered. "Mr. Langston, there's something I need to tell you. Something Mrs. Margaret made me promise only to reveal if there was no other choice." "What is it?" "The night she died, she called me to her study. She was afraid. She said she'd discovered something terrible about the Sterling family, about their shipping company, something that would send people to jail." Victor leaned forward. "What did she discover?" "She didn't tell me details, but she showed me a key." Maria's hands trembled. "She said if anything happened to her, I should give it to you, but the next morning when they found her, I was scared. I hid the key." Victor's heart was pounding. "Where?" "In the chapel, behind the third station of the cross." Maria grabbed his hand. "Mr. Langston, be careful. Mrs. Margaret, I don't think she fell. That night, I heard voices. When I went to check, I saw a man leaving her study, a man with silver hair." Victor felt like the ground was shifting under his feet. James Sterling had been in the mansion the night Margaret died? Does Ethan know? "I don't know. But recently he's been asking questions about that night. And last week I saw him in the chapel looking at the stations of the cross." Victor stood up. He had to get to that key before anyone else did. But as he turned to leave, Maria grabbed his arm. "Mr. Langston, wait. There's something else. That wooden box you asked about? The last time I saw it was the day of the accident. Mrs. Margaret was carrying it when she went to meet Mr. Sterling at his office. The chapel was dark and quiet when Victor slipped inside that evening. As Ben the janitor, he had access to every part of the estate, but his hand still trembled as he approached the stations of the cross. The third station, Jesus falls for the first time. How fitting, Victor thought bitterly. He ran his fingers behind the wooden carving and felt something metal, the key. Looking for something, Victor's heart nearly stopped. Ethan stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the evening light. "Just cleaning, sir," Victor said quickly. But he knew. His voice shook. "You know what's strange?" Ethan stepped into the chapel. "Maria never mentioned having a nephew before. You showed up, and you look familiar somehow." Victor's mind raced. Should he reveal himself? Before he could decide, another voice joined them. "Ethan, what are you doing here?" Vanessa appeared behind him, dressed for dinner in a red evening gown. "I could ask you the same thing," Ethan replied. "You said you were getting ready for dinner with your parents. I was just—" Vanessa faltered. "I wanted to say a prayer for your mother." Victor saw Ethan's face soften, and his heart ached. His son was still so trusting, just like Margaret had been. "I'll leave you folks to your prayers," Victor said, trying to edge toward the door. But Vanessa's sharp eyes caught the movement of his hand. "What's that? What did you take from behind the carving?" "Nothing, ma'am, just dust. Show me your hand." Vanessa's voice was like steel. That's when everything happened at once. The chapel door burst open again, and James Sterling rushed in, out of breath. "Vanessa, they know. The board knows everything." He stopped short when he saw Victor. "And Ethan." "Uncle James?" Ethan looked confused. "What's going on?" James Sterling's face hardened. "Give me what you found behind that carving now." "I don't know what you're talking about," Victor said, still in Ben's voice. "Stop playing games." James pulled out a gun. "Margaret hid something here 20 years ago, and I'm not leaving without it." Vanessa gasped. "Uncle James, what are you doing?" "What I should have done 20 years ago," James said grimly, "when your precious mother-in-law threatened to expose everything." Ethan stepped forward. "What are you talking about? What did my mother threaten to expose?" "She found out about the trafficking," James spat, "hidden among the legitimate shipping manifests. She was going to ruin everything we'd built." "Trafficking?" Ethan's face went white. "The Sterling Shipping Company was trafficking people?" "It was business," James said coldly. "Very profitable. Business? Until Margaret started poking around, found documents, proof. She threatened to go to the police." "So you killed her?" Victor couldn't keep the rage from his voice. "It was an accident." James's gun hand shook. "I just wanted the documents." She fought back, fell down the stair. "And now you're going to kill us too?" Ethan's voice was thick with disgust. "Is this why you pushed me to invest in rebuilding the company, Vanessa? To help cover up trafficking?" Vanessa's face crumpled. "I didn't know about the trafficking, I swear. I just knew we needed money to keep the investigation quiet. Uncle James said if we got control of Langston Industries' shipping division, we could bury everything." "Enough talking," James shouted. He pointed the gun directly at Victor. "The key. Now." Victor looked at his son, saw the pain and betrayal in his eyes. In that moment, he made his decision. "All right," he said, but not in Ben's voice, in his own voice. He reached up and removed the glasses, the grey wig. "You want to know what Margaret found? Let me show you." "Dad?" Ethan whispered in shock. James's eyes widened. "Victor, but you were supposed to be in Tibet." "I knew something was wrong," Victor said calmly, despite the gun pointed at his chest. "A father knows when his child is in danger, just like Margaret knew she had to protect our son from people like you. You've been spying on us?" Vanessa's voice shook. "I've been watching you destroy my son's trust piece by piece." Victor turned to Ethan. "I'm sorry for the deception, son, but your mother left something for us, something that will finally bring justice." "The box," James said. "Where is it?" Victor held up the key. "Margaret knew you'd search the house, so she hid it somewhere you'd never look, somewhere only family would know." Suddenly, Maria's voice rang out from the chapel entrance. "Police, don't move!" 2 police officers burst in, guns drawn. Behind them stood Maria, holding her phone. "I called them as soon as I saw Mr. Sterling enter with a gun." As the police handcuffed James, Victor turned to his son. "The box is in your mother's crypt. She knew it would be safe there, waiting for the right moment." Ethan's eyes filled with tears. "The letter I found, that Mom wrote that she'd discovered something terrible, that she was scared. She knew they might kill her. She died protecting us," Victor said softly. "And now we can finally bring her killers to justice." They watched as the police led James away. Vanessa stood alone, tears streaming down her face. "Ethan, I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I loved you in my way, I just—" "Save it," Ethan cut her off. "I hope you can live with yourself." Later that night, Victor and Ethan stood in the study. The wooden box finally opened between them. Inside were documents, photographs, shipping manifests, proof of 2 decades of crimes. "I keep thinking about Mom," Ethan said quietly. "All these years, we thought it was an accident." Victor put his arm around his son's shoulders. "She died protecting what she believed in. Protecting you." He paused. "Can you forgive me for the deception?" Ethan was quiet for a long moment. "You know what's strange? These past few weeks talking to Ben, I felt closer to you than I had in years. Maybe we both needed to see each other differently, Victor said, to remember what really matters. Through the window, they could see the chapel where Margaret's killer had finally confessed. The truth had come at a heavy price, but it had set them free just as Margaret had said it would. The morning newspapers blazed with headlines. Sterling shipping empire crumbles, decades of human trafficking exposed. Victor set the paper aside, looking across the breakfast table at his son. They were both exhausted after a night of answering police questions. The reporters are still camped outside the gate, Maria announced, bringing in fresh coffee. She'd been their rock through everything, just as she'd been for the past 30 years. Let them wait, Victor said. He had more important things to worry about. Ethan, son, we need to talk about everything. Ethan nodded slowly. Dark circles under his eyes showed he hadn't slept. I keep thinking about Vanessa. How could I have been so blind? Love makes us blind sometimes, Victor said gently. Your mother taught me that. I was so focused on business I couldn't see what was happening right in front of me. Is that why you became Ben? Ethan asked. To see what you couldn't see before? Partly. Victor took a deep breath. But also because I've spent 20 years buried in work, trying to avoid the pain of losing your mother. I forgot how to just be a father. Maria quietly slipped out, leaving them alone. You know what's funny? Ethan stirred his coffee, absently. When I was talking to Ben about Mom, about my doubts about Vanessa, it was the first time in years I felt like I could really open up to someone. Sometimes it's easier to talk to a stranger, Victor said, remembering Ethan's words from before. But I don't want to be a stranger anymore, son. Tears welled in Ethan's eyes. When I found Mom's letter in the library, she wrote about how much she loved us, how she knew something bad might happen to her. She made me promise to watch over you, Dad. Victor felt his own eyes burning, and I promised her I'd protect you. I just did it in a rather unconventional way. A ghost of a smile crossed Ethan's face. You know, you made a pretty convincing janitor. My back is still complaining about it. Victor chuckled, then turned serious. The board is meeting this afternoon. They'll want to know everything about the Sterling connection. What are you going to tell them? The truth, that James Sterling tried to use you to gain control of our shipping division to cover up his crimes. That your mother discovered their trafficking operation 20 years ago and paid with her life. Victor paused. And that it's time for some changes at Langston Industries. Ethan looked up sharply. What kind of changes? I'm thinking of stepping back, not retiring completely, but making room for new leadership. Victor met his son's eyes. If you're interested, Dad, not because you're my son, Victor added quickly, but because these past few weeks watching you as Ben, I saw something. You have your mother's heart, but you also have good business instincts. You knew something was wrong with Vanessa's plans for the company, even if you couldn't put your finger on it. Their conversation was interrupted by Maria rushing in. Mr. Langston, turn on the television, quick. Victor grabbed the remote. The news showed Vanessa being led into the police station in handcuffs. Breaking news, the reporter announced. Vanessa Sterling has turned state's evidence against her uncle James Sterling and the trafficking ring. Sources say Ms. Sterling has provided crucial information about operations dating back 2 decades. Ethan watched in silence, his face unreadable. Are you okay? Victor asked softly. I thought I loved her, Ethan said, but now I wonder if I ever really knew her at all. Sometimes the heart sees what it wants to see. Victor remembered his own blind spots. The important thing is being able to learn from our mistakes. Later that afternoon, they visited Margaret's grave together for the first time in years. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the peaceful cemetery. I've been thinking, Ethan said as they stood before the headstone, about what you said about changes at the company. Victor waited patiently. I want to do it, Ethan continued, but not just business as usual. Mom died trying to expose human trafficking. I want to use our resources to fight it, set up a foundation in her name. Pride swelled in Victor's chest. She would have loved that. And Dad? Ethan turned to him. I want us to run it together, not as CEO and heir, but as partners, like we were these past few weeks, even if I didn't know it was you. Victor pulled his son into a tight hug, remembering all the embraces he'd held back over the years. Partners, he agreed. As they walked back to the car, Maria was waiting with news. The police just called. They found more evidence in James Sterling's office. Documents going back 30 years. He wasn't working alone. More arrests, Victor asked. Maria nodded. High-level people. politicians, business leaders. It's going to get bigger before it's over. Then we'll face it together, Ethan said firmly. No more secrets, no more hiding. That evening, Victor sat in his study, looking at Margaret's portrait. The same portrait he'd questioned weeks ago when this all began. But now he saw something different in her eyes. Not sadness, but determination. The same determination he'd seen in Ethan's eyes today. You'd be proud of him, Victor whispered to the portrait. He has your courage, your integrity. There was a knock at the door. Ethan came in carrying 2 cups of coffee, not in fine china, but in the simple mugs the staff used. Thought you might need this, he said with a small smile. Old habits. Die hard. Victor laughed, accepting the mug. You know, I might miss being Ben a little bit. The staff tells much better gossip downstairs. Well, maybe we both learned something from him. Ethan sat down. Ben showed me how to open up again, and he showed you how to listen. They sat in comfortable silence, drinking coffee from plain mugs, while outside the media frenzy continued. And the world learned about the Sterling family's crimes. But in here, a father and son had found their way back to each other. And somewhere, Victor was sure, Margaret was smiling. 1 month later, the Langston mansion was buzzing with activity, but not for the wedding that had been planned. Instead, reporters and business leaders filled the grand ballroom for the announcement of the Margaret Langston Foundation. Are you ready? Victor asked Ethan, who was adjusting his tie in front of the mirror, the same mirror where this whole story had begun. Almost. Ethan took a deep breath. I just wish your mother could be here. Victor finished softly. Yeah. Ethan turned to face his father. But in a way she is. Everything we're doing, it's because of her. The past month had been a whirlwind. The Sterling investigation had grown bigger by the day, uncovering trafficking networks across 3 continents. James Sterling had agreed to a plea deal, providing evidence against dozens of conspirators. Vanessa, in exchange for her cooperation, had received a lighter sentence. Mr. Langston? Maria appeared at the door. They're ready for you both. As they walked toward the ballroom, Victor noticed Ethan hesitate near the library. Something wrong? No, just... Ethan smiled slightly, remembering all those conversations with Ben. You know, some of the staff still ask about him. Well, he did do excellent work with the windows, Victor chuckled, though my back is grateful to be back in Italian suits instead of that janitor's uniform. They entered the ballroom to camera flashes and murmuring voices. The podium was set up in front of a large portrait of Margaret, not the formal oil painting from Victor's study, but a candid photo of her working with the charity organizations she'd loved. Victor stepped up to the microphone first. 20 years ago, my wife Margaret Langston discovered a terrible truth. Instead of looking away, she chose to fight. She paid for that choice with her life, but her courage didn't die with her. Today, we honor her legacy. He gestured for Ethan to join him. Together, they unveiled the Foundation's mission statement, fighting human trafficking through corporate responsibility. The Margaret Langston Foundation, Ethan announced, his voice, strong and clear, will work with businesses worldwide to identify and prevent trafficking in global supply chains. We're committing $1 billion to this fight. The reporter's questions flew fast. Mr. Langston, how will this affect your other business interests? Is this a response to the Sterling scandal? What about Vanessa Sterling's allegations? Victor held up his hand. This foundation isn't about scandals or allegations. It's about continuing the work my wife began. She believed that business could be both profitable and ethical. That's the legacy we're building. After the press conference, they retreated to the quiet of the garden. Rosa, the kitchen assistant who'd been so kind to Ben, brought them coffee in the same simple mugs they'd grown to prefer over fine china. The board approved all the changes? Ethan asked, sipping his coffee. Victor nodded. Unanimously. The shipping division will be the first to implement the new oversight protocols and, he smiled, they were very impressed with your presentation last week. I learned from the best. Ethan paused. Both of you. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. The garden was Margaret's favorite place. She'd designed it herself, insisting on plants that would feed local birds and butterflies rather than just look pretty. I got a letter from Vanessa yesterday, Ethan said suddenly. Victor tensed. What did she want? To apologize, mostly. She said she never knew about the trafficking until after we were engaged. By then she felt trapped. Ethan shook his head. She said learning about Mom's courage made her finally do the right thing. Do you believe her? I don't know. Ethan set down his mug. But it doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what we do now. Maria joined them, carrying a small, wooden box. Not the one that had contained Margaret's evidence, but one Victor recognized from her personal belongings. "I found this while cleaning out the storage rooms," she said. "I thought you might want to see it." Inside were photographs, letters, and a small diary. Margaret had documented everything, not just the evidence of crimes, but her hopes for the future, her dreams for Ethan, her love for Victor. "Look at this." Ethan pulled out a letter dated just days before her death. She wrote about wanting to start a foundation, to help people who couldn't help themselves. Victor read over his shoulder, his heart aching at the familiar handwriting. "Business isn't just about profits, it's about people, about making the world better for our children. Sometimes that means taking risks, standing up for what's right even when it's hard, even when it's dangerous." "She knew," Victor said softly. "She knew what might happen, but she did it anyway. Because it was right," Ethan finished. A commotion at the garden gate drew their attention. Robert Sterling, Vanessa's father and James's brother, was arguing with security. "Should I call the police?" Maria asked, reaching for her phone. "No," Victor said, standing. "I'll handle this." He walked to the gate, Ethan beside him. Robert looked nothing like the polished businessman who'd tried to manipulate them months ago. His clothes were rumpled, his eyes haunted. "I had to come," he said as they approached. "I had to tell you I didn't know. About James, about the trafficking. I swear I didn't know. But you suspected something wasn't right," Victor said quietly. "Just like Margaret did." Robert's face crumpled. "I was a coward. I looked the other way because it was easier. Because of money." He pulled out an envelope. "These are documents, bank accounts, contacts, and everything I know about the operation. Maybe they can help your foundation." Victor took the envelope, seeing the tremor in Robert's hands. "Why now?" "Because I read Margaret's letter in the papers. The one from her diary about standing up for what's right." Robert wiped his eyes. "Better late than never, right?" They watched him walk away, a broken man trying to find redemption. "Think he's telling the truth?" Ethan asked. "Yes," Victor said. "I've seen enough lies lately to recognize the truth." That evening they had dinner in the kitchen, something that would have been unthinkable months ago. The staff joined them, sharing stories about Margaret, about Ben, about the changes they'd all been through. "To new beginnings," Victor raised his coffee mug. "And to Mom," Ethan added. Outside, the garden Margaret had loved so much bloomed in the twilight. Butterflies danced among the flowers, free and beautiful, just as she'd wanted. 6 months later, the first success stories from the Margaret Langston Foundation were making headlines. Victor sat in his office, not the imposing penthouse suite he'd once occupied, but a smaller space he now shared with Ethan. The wall between their offices had literally and figuratively come down. "Dad, you need to see this," Ethan burst in, waving a tablet. The Thailand operation was successful, 35 people rescued, and the company involved is fully cooperating with authorities. Victor smiled, remembering how Margaret's eyes would light up the same way when she talked about helping others. "Your mother would be proud." "Mr. Langston," Maria appeared in the doorway. "You have a visitor." To their surprise, Diana Sterling, Vanessa's mother, stood behind her. She looked smaller somehow, less polished than the social climber who'd once evaluated their mansion like an antique for sale. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to see," she said quietly. "But I had to come." Victor gestured for her to sit. Ethan moved to leave, but she stopped him. "Please stay, you both should hear this." Diana pulled out a yellowed envelope. "I found this while cleaning out our house. It's a letter from your mother." Victor and Ethan exchanged glances. "Another letter. It's dated a week before she died," Diana continued. "She wrote to me, woman to woman, mother to mother. She knew about James's trafficking operation, but she also knew I was trapped in my own way. She offered to help me leave, to take Vanessa somewhere safe." Diana's voice broke. "I was too scared to accept, and because of my cowardice, she died, and my daughter grew up in a world of lies." Ethan took the letter with trembling hands. Margaret's familiar handwriting flowed across the page. "Diana, we're both mothers who want to protect our children. Sometimes that means having the courage to start over. It's never too late to choose a different path." "She was right," Diana said softly. "That's why I'm here. I want to help the foundation. I know things, names, methods they used to hide their operations. And," she hesitated, "I'd like to visit Vanessa in prison, to finally be the mother she needed." After Diana left, Victor found Ethan in Margaret's garden. The foundation had helped restore it to its former glory, and butterflies once again danced among the flowers. "It never ends, does it?" Ethan said, as Victor sat beside him. "Mom's influence, her choices, they're still changing lives." "That's her real legacy," Victor agreed. "Not just exposing the truth, but showing people they can change." A commotion from the kitchen drew their attention. Rosa was chasing after her young son, Miguel, who'd been helping with deliveries. "Mijo, be careful with those boxes." "I got it, Mama," Miguel called back, then promptly tripped. Packages went flying. Victor and Ethan rushed to help, gathering scattered supplies, donations for a shelter the foundation supported. As they worked, Miguel stared at Victor. "Mom says you used to be Ben the janitor," he said suddenly. "Is that true?" Victor laughed. "Yes, it's true. But you're rich. Why would you pretend to be a janitor?" "Miguel," Rosa scolded, but Victor held up his hand. "It's a fair question," he said. "I did it because sometimes we need to see things differently to understand what's really important." He looked at Ethan. "Sometimes we need to become someone else to remember who we really are." Later that evening, the mansion hosted a different kind of gathering. The staff had organized a surprise party for Maria's 30-year anniversary with the family. The formal dining room was decorated with streamers, and Rosa had baked a cake. "Speech," everyone called as Maria blushed. "I'm not good at speeches," she protested, but Victor stood up. "Then let me say something." He looked around the room, at the staff who'd become family, at his son who'd grown into a man Margaret would be proud of, at the portrait of his wife smiling down at them all. 30 years ago, Maria joined this household. She helped raise my son, supported my wife, and kept me grounded when I forgot what mattered. She taught me that family isn't about blood or titles or bank accounts. It's about love, truth, and having the courage to stand up for what's right. "Hear, hear!" The room echoed with cheers and clinking glasses. As the party continued, Victor slipped away to the study. He removed Margaret's diary from his desk drawer. He'd been reading a few pages each night, getting to know his wife, again through her words. Today's entry caught his eye. "Love is like a butterfly. You can't force it to land. You can't cage it without destroying it. You can only create the right environment and trust it will come." Victor works so hard to build walls to protect us, but sometimes walls become cages. I hope one day he learns that true strength comes from being vulnerable, from letting love in. Deep thoughts? Victor looked up to find Ethan in the doorway, holding 2 mugs of coffee. "Your mother's words," Victor said, accepting a mug. "She was wiser than I ever knew." "Well, she did marry you," Ethan teased. "She must have seen something worth loving." Victor smiled. "She saw the man I could become. It just took me 20 years and a janitor's uniform to become him." Through the window, they could see the party spilling into Margaret's garden. Staff children chased each other around the butterfly bushes, while their parents laughed and shared stories. The walls between upstairs and downstairs had crumbled, just like the walls in Victor's heart. "You know what's funny?" Ethan said. "When all this started, I thought I was going to get married, start a perfect life. Instead, everything fell apart. And now? Now I realize that sometimes things have to fall apart so we can build something better." Ethan raised his mug. "To Mom, who taught us that love and truth are worth fighting for. To Margaret," Victor echoed, "who gave us a second chance to become the family she always knew we could be." As they sipped their coffee, still in the simple mugs they'd grown to prefer, butterflies danced in the garden's twilight, free, beautiful, and unafraid, just like the love that had finally broken through their walls. 1 year to the day after Victor had first donned Ben's janitor uniform, the mansion was hosting another gathering, but this time, it wasn't for society's elite. The gardens were filled with families, survivors helped by the Margaret Langston Foundation, staff members and their children, and even some reformed executives who'd chosen to help after their companies were exposed. "Remember when this garden was just for show," Maria said, watching children play among the butterfly bushes. "Mrs. Margaret would have loved this." Victor nodded, remembering how his wife had fought to make the garden more natural, more welcoming. She always said beauty wasn't about perfection. It was about letting things grow freely. Ethan was at the grill, something that would have been unthinkable a year ago, flipping burgers alongside Rosa's husband. The young man who'd once lived for board meetings and social status now seemed most at home in jeans and a casual shirt, talking and laughing with everyone. "Mr. Langston," a small woman approached shyly. Victor recognized her from the Thailand rescue operation. "I wanted to thank you because of your "Foundation, my children will grow up free." Before Victor could respond, they were interrupted by excited shouts from the children. A monarch butterfly had emerged from its chrysalis on one of Margaret's butterfly bushes, spreading its wings for the first time. "Perfect timing," Ethan said, joining them. "Mom always said butterflies were messages from heaven." The afternoon turned to evening, but no one wanted to leave. The formal gardens had become a place of healing, of community. Staff children taught games to the rescued children, while their parents shared stories of survival and hope. Victor found himself sitting with Maria on Margaret's favorite garden bench. "I got a letter from Vanessa today," he said quietly. Maria raised an eyebrow. What did she want? "To make amends. She's been taking classes in prison, learning about human trafficking. When she gets out, she wants to help educate others about the warning signs." He shook his head. "Amazing how things change." "People can surprise you," Maria agreed. "Look, at you, who would have thought Victor Langston would ever learn to mop floors?" Victor laughed. "I still have the calluses to prove it." They watched as Ethan showed some of the children how to plant new butterfly-friendly flowers. He'd taken charge of maintaining Margaret's garden, expanding it to include a vegetable patch where staff families could grow their own food. "He's dating again, you know," Maria said casually. Victor nodded. "Sarah, from the Victim Support Center. I like her. She has Margaret's spirit, more interested in helping others than in social status." "And what about you?" Maria asked gently. "Are you ready to open your heart again?" Victor touched his wedding ring, which he still wore. "Margaret will always be my great love, but she taught me that love grows when you share it." He smiled. "Besides, I have a different kind of love now. Look around, all these people, this community we've built. This is my family too." As if to prove his point, Miguel came running up. "Mr. Langston, can you help us? We're building a butterfly house." Victor let the boy pull him toward where the children were constructing a shelter for catching and releasing butterflies. He found himself working alongside former executives, domestic staff, and survivors, all differences, forgotten in the simple joy of creating something together. Later, as the sun set, everyone gathered for a special ceremony. The foundation had started a tradition of releasing butterflies in honor of those who'd been helped and those who'd helped them. Ethan stood to speak, his voice carrying across the quiet garden. "A year ago, this family was broken. We lived behind walls of secrets and lies. But my mother knew something we'd forgotten, that true strength comes from being vulnerable, from letting love in." He gestured to the butterfly house they'd built. "Like these butterflies, we can't force love or trust. We can only create the right environment and have faith. Mom created that environment in this garden, and now we're extending it to the world through her foundation." Victor watched as Sarah slipped her hand into Ethan's, and his son's face lit up with a joy he hadn't seen since before Margaret's death. Around them, the garden glowed with paper lanterns, and the evening air was filled with the sound of children's laughter. "Your mother was right," Victor said softly to Ethan as they prepared to release the butterflies. "Sometimes things have to fall apart so we can build something better." Together, they opened the butterfly house. Dozens of monarchs took flight, their wings catching the last rays of sunlight. Children gasped in delight, and even the adults fell silent in awe. Among the spectators, Victor noticed Diana Sterling standing with a young woman he recognized as one of the foundation's success stories. They were both crying but smiling too. Healing came in many forms. Maria appeared with coffee, still in those simple mugs that had become their tradition. "Mrs. Margaret used to say that butterflies were souls in flight," she said. "That every time we see one, it's carrying a message of hope." As the butterflies dispersed into the evening sky, Victor looked around at his expanded family, son and staff, survivors and supporters, all brought together by Margaret's legacy of love. "The message got through, Margaret," he whispered to the twilight garden. "It just took some of us longer to understand it." 18 months after Victor first became Ben the janitor, he stood in front of Margaret's portrait in the study, adjusting his tie. But this time he wasn't preparing for a board meeting or a press conference. "You look fine, Mr. Langston," Maria said, straightening the flower in his lapel. "Stop fidgeting. I never thought I'd be nervous about giving my son away at his wedding," Victor admitted. The mansion was once again filled with flowers, but not the formal arrangements that had decorated Ethan's almost wedding to Vanessa. These were wildflowers from Margaret's garden, arranged by the staff's children under Rosa's direction. "Dad," Ethan appeared in the doorway, looking handsome in his tuxedo. "Can we talk?" Maria slipped out, leaving father and son alone. Having second thoughts, Victor asked. No, Ethan smiled, just thinking about how different everything is from last year. If you hadn't become Ben, if your mother hadn't left us the clues we needed, if we hadn't all learned to see beyond the surface. Ethan touched his mother's portrait gently. Sarah asked me something interesting last night. She wanted to know if we should have the wedding somewhere else, given what happened with Vanessa here. What did you tell her? That this isn't the same place anymore, just like we're not the same people. Ethan turned to his father. You know what's funny? When I was engaged to Vanessa, everything was about appearances. The perfect wedding, the perfect couple, the perfect life. But with Sarah, it's about what's real, Victor finished. The garden where the ceremony would take place was a testament to that change. The foundation's families had helped decorate, hanging paper lanterns and spreading wildflower petals. Children darted between the rows of chairs, playing games rather than being forced to sit still and look proper. Mr. Langston? Miguel poked his head in. Mom says it's time. As they walked to the garden, they passed the spot where Victor had first overheard Vanessa's suspicious phone call. Now that same corner held a memorial plaque, the Margaret Langston Memorial Garden, where truth and love take flight. The ceremony was everything Margaret would have loved. Sarah, beautiful in a simple dress, walked down the aisle not to formal organ music, but to a children's choir singing Butterfly Kisses. The foundation families filled the seats alongside business leaders who'd joined their cause. Even Diana. Sterling was there, accompanied by her daughter from prison. Vanessa had been granted a day pass to attend. When it came time for the vows, Sarah and Ethan had written their own. I promise to love you not for who I want you to be, Sarah said, but for who you are, to build a life based on truth and compassion. I promise to keep my heart open, Ethan replied, his voice thick with emotion. To remember that love isn't about perfection, but about growing together. Victor felt tears in his eyes as he watched them exchange rings. He remembered his own wedding to Margaret, how young and sure they'd been. They'd had their struggles, their moments of distance, but her love had never wavered. Even at the end, she'd chosen truth and justice over safety. At the reception, another tradition had been born. Instead of formal dances and champagne toasts, the foundation families shared their stories of hope and renewal. Children released butterflies into the evening sky, their wishes for the newlyweds carried on delicate wings. Your mother would have loved this, Victor said to Ethan during a quiet moment. She's here, Ethan replied, pointing to a monarch butterfly that had landed on Sarah's bouquet. She's in every life we've helped change, every truth we've helped uncover. Victor watched as Sarah danced with some of the rescued children, her laughter mixing with theirs. She worked tirelessly at the foundation, turning her own experience with deception into a force for good. Later, as the party wound down, Victor found himself back in the study with Maria. Remember that first day? She asked, handing him a mug of coffee. They never had gone back to fine china. When you told me your crazy plan to become Ben, you thought I'd lost my mind. I did, Maria smiled, but you proved me wrong. You didn't just save Ethan from a bad marriage, you helped build something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. Through the window they could see the garden twinkling with lanterns. Ethan and Sarah were dancing slowly, surrounded by fireflies and the occasional late butterfly. The foundation families were helping clean up, working alongside the staff as equals. Diana was deep in conversation with her daughter, both women crying and hugging. You know what Margaret wrote in her last diary entry? Victor said softly. She wrote, "Love is like a butterfly. It can't be forced or caged, but if you create the right environment, it will always find its way home." Just then, a familiar figure appeared in the doorway. Robert Sterling, Vanessa's father. He looked healthier than the last time they'd seen him, more at peace. "I wanted to thank you," he said quietly. "The foundation's work. It's helping heal old wounds. Vanessa is different now. We all are." Victor nodded. Margaret used to say that the truth can hurt, but lies hurt more in the end. She was right. Robert hesitated. "We're starting a support group for families affected by trafficking. Would you come speak to them sometime, tell them about Margaret's courage?" "I'd be honored," Victor said, and he meant it. As the evening drew to a close, Victor stood in Margaret's garden one last time. The butterflies had settled down for the night, but their presence lingered in the gentle movement of the flowers, in the peace that had finally come to this place. "We did it, my love," he whispered to the stars. "We created the right environment. Love found its way home, From somewhere in the garden came the sound of children's laughter, of shared stories of healing hearts. The walls that had once divided them, between rich and poor, between appearance and reality, between truth and lies, had crumbled like autumn leaves, making room for new growth. And in the gentle night breeze, Victor could almost hear Margaret's voice. Love is like a butterfly. Sometimes you have to let it go to watch it soar. The end.